Hello, good evening. My name's Antony Zacharias. Welcome to this webinar on astrophotography and photographing the night sky. I'd like to say a big thank you to Lumesca and BenQ for hosting this presentation, and it's something I really hope that you will all learn at least one new skill from, and hopefully start being able to take more interesting images of the night sky. So yes, I'll move on. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Antony Zacharias. My information is there in front of you. I'm a long exposure photographer, really specializing more into the realms of architecture, travel, and astrophotography. I am proud to be a BenQ expert, having been using BenQ monitors for quite some time now, and I'm also the author of a number of photographic texts, photography books, including the one in front of you on the screen, Mastering Long Exposure, the definitive guide for photographers, and here are a few more. My latest book, Photographic Exposure, on the right hand side, is out this year in June in the UK and Europe, and North America and Australasia in September. So plug over, so apologies for that, but let's move straight into the fun part for you guys, astrophotography, photographing the moon, the stars, the Milky Way, the night sky in general. Obviously, you're all here because you're interested in doing so, but I've listed four sort of fundamental key factors for myself and why I enjoy doing it, and hopefully it's a similar thing for yourselves. Really creating inspirational images for our audience. There's such a wonderment out there of the universe, and everyone loves to see the beauty of the night sky. So obviously there's that primary factor. And another is the opportunity really to capture more than we can see with our eyes. Sometimes, you know, if you're in the middle of nowhere with no or limited light pollution and we can see a beautiful starry sky, it's actually amazing to know that our cameras, the technological advances are amazing, and we can really sort of see so much more and capture so much more, and then really pour over it later and show that on to friends and family, etc. I certainly find the adventure of photography, it can be quite difficult sometimes, you know, living in the city or urban environments, but there's something really pleasurable to get out and about and really sort of set that adventure of planning and hoping for the weather and the light and the stars and everything coming together and then ending up with a beautiful image. And I find that when you find yourself standing in the middle of a forest or a field in the, you know, in the darkest nights with no moon, and capturing the starry sky, wondering what you're actually doing when you're freezing cold and hoping it's not going to rain, and all the sounds of wild animals hopefully staying far away from you. When you get back and the next day you start looking at some of the images you've captured, and it really does make it so worthwhile and really part of that sort of adventure side of things. And as a long exposure photographer, certainly something that I really like to do is have the ability to capture a long period of time, more than we'd ordinarily see with our own eyes, and record that period of time into a single image, a single two-dimensional image, and that can really sort of create a lot of wonderment for our viewers. I speak of worrying about what you're doing in the middle of a field, but certainly this was one image taken a little while ago now, but it was certainly one that was incredibly rewarding, and I think one that fills a lot of wonderment for our viewers. You know, everyone loves, as I say, looking into the night sky and wondering what's out there, and sometimes it's amazing to be able to capture some of that and sort of have people look with intrigue at your image. So I'll start off, there's a lot of questions usually about what gear do you need to get into taking astro photographs, and from the outset I really must say try it first, because it's all good and well saying, right, I'm going to go out and buy a telescope and a tracker and all those various things and the most expensive X and Y, but you really don't need to a point. I put here some essentials on this page, and the key essentials obviously are the larger sensor gives you a better resolution. So a full frame sensor, if you have that a full frame camera, fantastic, because you're going to be pushing your ISOs to quite an extreme. But that doesn't mean that you can't do that with a crop sensor. Your results might not be as sharp or as you're not going to capture as much detail, but it's certainly a good place to start. So don't be sort of put off by thinking, well, I've only got a crop sensor camera and I'm really not going to bother. Some point and shoots, these that are out are amazing too. So you can sort of try, I think going beyond a point and shoot to a sort of an iPad or a phone is really sort of pushing it a little bit, but really we're going to focus on using a full frame camera. But when you couple your camera with lenses, that's really going to help you take your astrophotography to avoid the cliche, but another level, using a fast lens, the fastest that you can. A minimum f4 is ideal, but 2.8, 1.8, 1.4, really big, wide apertures that you're able to gather in a lot of light will really be very helpful. I've put a lot of information here about using stopping down and that sort of thing, but ideally you can use your kit lens, your 18 to 55, usually an f3.5. Again, you're not going to gather as much light, but you can still use it. So it's certainly, don't think that that's not something that you have to rush out and buy very expensive lenses. And as you get more involved and really enjoy it, you'll find that naturally that'll be something, a consideration that you make. Angles, focal range of your lens, obviously a wide angle or wider angle gives you much more opportunity to capture more of the night sky and some foreground for foreground interest. So as I've written here, 14 to 24 millimeters on a full frame camera is ideal. Obviously bear in mind if you're using crop sensors for the equivalents. But again, use different lenses. 50 mils can be used quite well. You can buy a cheap 50 millimeter f1.8, and that can still be used for fantastic results. A tripod is something I really obviously recommend getting the best that you can afford to buy. You don't want something so big and heavy and cumbersome that you don't really want to carry it around with you. So carbon fiber is a good way to go there, but certainly you need to keep your camera stable for these long exposures. That's critical. And a remote shutter release, you don't really want to risk either pressing the shutter button and shaking your camera, etc. So having a remote release, personally I use personally I think we use a wide version because that will really just enable you not to have to worry about batteries running out and that sort of thing. So other gear, it's useful obviously to have spare batteries, a torch, all these sort of things that I've listed here. I won't just read them out verbatim, but they're pretty useful to have. I'll sort of delve in a little bit about the torch in due course, but bear in mind that obviously you don't want to be standing outside in the cold, hungry, and but the whole sort of process becomes very sort of convoluted and miserable. So I can really recommend, having some snacks and that kind of thing to make it a bit more enjoyable. I've got a little list at the end of some apps and websites that you'll hopefully all find useful to help with weather and positions of the planets and the Milky Way and that kind of thing. I'm not really going to delve in too much here at all really about the telescope and camera adapters for deep sky images. That's very sort of technical and very specialist. A very quick mention, there was a question from Alan about condensation building up, which is something we'll touch on in a moment, but you can buy a heater for your lens or some sort of installation, because standing outside in the cold with the camera battery can create condensation. So you do have the option of doing that, but even just a lens cloth, just periodically wipe through. So a few general tips to consider. Hopefully everyone is shooting raw and knows the benefits of doing so, or gives you much more flexibility in editing and changing your white balance, and that's very much of importance with astrophotography, because you want to get sort of precise color balance and that sort of thing, and have a broad dynamic range so that in one image you can certainly pull out much more information in highlights, recovering highlights, and in the shadow information. There's lots of things to turn off auto ISO, image stabilization if you have that on your lens or in the camera, the long exposure, noise reduction, and all these sort of things, because ultimately they will just, you want complete control over the camera itself. And something I recommend to do is really sort of test your particular camera at night and see what the ranges of ISO, how much noise do you actually get in your images, and what you deem acceptable. Sometimes pushing your camera, I know for my particular full frame camera, I can go easily to 6400 ISO without too much trouble for noise. So I know that that's a very comfortable position to be in, but your camera may go higher or lower. So it's certainly something that I recommend checking out. Planning considerations are vital again in this realm of photography. Astrophotography is probably more so than any other types of photography, or certainly up there with all the others. There are so many considerations to make. Yes, we're photographing light as any sort of photograph, but ultimately there is quite a lot of planning involved, and it's important to do some basic research and just have an idea of where you're going, what you're doing, and that sort of thing, because it will really just, the rewards will just be immense for such a little amount of work. Certainly, sort of 20 minutes on the internet, and you can certainly radically improve your chances of getting fantastic images, and certainly not wasting your time too. Light pollution is the biggest factor, I think, in choosing your location in taking star shots. I know there's been quite a lot of questions from viewers about how to find areas of natural darkness, and obviously that's a difficult situation and difficult position to be in certain places. I live in London, so I certainly have to head off quite far away to find areas of the dark sky, and there are sort of parks and that kind of thing. There are numerous websites and apps and various things that you can either purchase or resources that you can find online. But as we'll touch in a moment, you can still take night photos of the stars in an urban environment. It's just a slightly different way to do it, and obviously the results will not be quite so impressive, but you can still certainly do that. Weather, again, is another major factor. If you've got a lot of cloud cover building up, and you're not going to see many stars or the Milky Way, so certainly sort of checking the weather. Again, there's very detailed forecasts available for free in apps that will do that, and that can save a lot of wasted journeys. So that's something to bear in mind too. I've touched in here, tide times are critical, obviously, if you are shooting near the ocean, to be careful, and if you're leaving your camera on a tripod in the dark, you need to take care that the tide doesn't come in and destroy your camera and that sort of thing. And composition, we'll touch on that throughout this presentation, really, because obviously you can take photographs of just the night sky itself, but you really want to capture some sort of subject matter to add a little bit of interest to a composition, to really sort of add that wow factor to your landscape or architecture or whatever. And then to completely contradict myself, my next image has no foreground interest. This is a composite of a number of images of obviously the moon, the lunar eclipse of a total eclipse of the moon, blood moon. It was very much a last minute out of the window kind of situation, because suddenly the clouds cleared and I was able to capture it. But the forecast had been for heavy cloud cover, so I didn't even bother to venture far away at all, thinking I wasn't going to be able to do that. But still, sometimes just capturing it as is nice anyway, just to sort of for the satisfaction, and again in a composite can still look very beautiful, showing others what they wouldn't necessarily ordinarily see. For photographing the moon, we'll touch on this very briefly, because I know most of us really sort of consider astrophotography taking pictures of the Milky Way and stars, etc. But the moon, there is a big misconception that you need a very long shutter speed because it's in the night. But actually the moon is very, very bright. It's the rest of the scene that is the dark night sky. So there's a trade-off. We'll find that there's a trade-off in a lot of aspects of astrophotography. You either underexpose the background and have the moon correct, or overexpose the moon to have sufficient exposure on the foreground or background. So there's a bit of a trade-off. Usually bracketing your images and combining those in post-production is the way to really sort of deal with that. For example, here, this is clearly a composite image. They were both taken at the same time, at the same location. I used a tripod with a wide angle down low to get the sort of foreground grasses, and then literally without moving the camera, put in a telephoto and then took a picture of the moon and then combined those in post-production to create something a little bit different. But bear in mind, the moon generally appears larger when it's closer to the horizon, so that's always quite a nice way to sort of ensure that you get a larger moon. But again, using a larger focal range, a telephoto lens will enable you to get to fill the frame a little bit more with the moon. So again, just some basic settings here to start out. And I know, in case anyone's sort of scribbling these down very fast, I know that the kind people at BenQ and Lumesca are going to sort of make this available. So you can certainly just play back at your own speed and take notes of any of the settings that I've put here in due course. So, but as I say, the moon's moving. We need to use a relatively fast shutter speed, so around 1/250th of a second. It's quite bright, so we don't need to shoot wide open. So an f5.6, something like that, and a low ISO. A good tip here is to use spot metering on the moon itself to make sure that that doesn't overexpose, because otherwise, if you're just using a matrix or evaluative, the camera's computer will get a little bit confused what it's trying to do, and normally, at the sake of exposing the moon correctly, will expose for everything else instead of the moon. So that's a good little useful way to ensure that the moon isn't just a little white blob in your photograph. So the focusing in the dark, we'll move on to that, which is another immense topic of confusion for a lot of people. We're heading out into the dark. We can't just throw on autofocus and know that our camera will reliably focus on what it is we want to take an image of. So how do we do that? Obviously, it's very tricky. Our lenses have an infinity mark, but that's unreliable. It's not like an old-fashioned sort of manual hard lens that had a hard stop where you knew that you were pretty much in at the infinity mark. It's a good place to start, but ultimately you really want to use manual focus. Autofocus is unlikely to work well. You can try to use a single autofocus point at a specific area, as I've written here, of high contrast, but that's not quite so helpful if you're really trying to ensure that your stars are pin sharp. So manual focus is certainly the way to go. And the best method here is to really turn on your live view. It's a fantastic, almost revolutionary. Obviously, it's been around for a long time, but it changed a lot of aspects of our ability to take photographs of the night sky. So zoom in at 10%, 100% on the Canon, it's 10 times, and ensure focus manually until the stars themselves just appear as a very, very small pixel without any soft edges. You'll find that if you go a little bit beyond the focal point, they'll start to blur around the edges, so then just that you've gone a little bit too far and you can pull back. But using a very high ISO will help make your stars more visible. So putting in your exposure settings in advance or beyond those will really sort of help the camera let in a little bit more light. So even if you're going to change your aperture, it's best to use the widest one that you have available to really sort of help your camera absorb as much light as possible while you focus. I've written here, if you're going to take an image, for example, like the next one, I'll just pop down. So this castle with the stars behind, it was actually lit itself these lights stayed on all the time, so that actually did help. But I did use the technique here of a bright torch just to illuminate a little patch on the camera, on the castle, and then I could use that to ensure that I still with manual focus. You could use autofocus, but it was fine to do it with manually, and make sure that you have a sharp focal point, and then take a test shot and zoom in and see exactly where you are. So photographing the stars, obviously they add a beautiful background to an image, and but sharp focus really is critical. So going back to what we were just saying, really sort of check before you sort of pack up and go home. Zoom in on your images as much as you can on the back of your LCD, on your camera, to make sure that you've got sharp focus, because it's very disappointing to get back and zoom into 100% and you realize that they're all a little bit out of focus. But it really is just a lot of trade-offs in astrophotography, and I think it's important to sort of accept that sometimes you're going to have to use a composite image to get enough light to light up your foreground or your subject matter, and sufficient light but not too much to wash out the night sky. So yes, I've written here, shoot when the moon is rising and the light will stay constant, but also you can use moonlight if the moon is behind you to really help sort of illuminate your foreground. Just make sure that the moon is positioned behind you so that it doesn't wash out that part of the sky that you're trying to take images of. So where do we start taking photographs of the stars themselves? You might have heard photographers or magazines talk about the 500 rule, and it's a good place to start to work out your shutter speed. And really all you have to do, it's just a ballpark figure from where to start, but you take 500 and divide the focal length that you're using into this 500, and that will give you the maximum number of seconds you can use to determine your shutter speed. So for example, if I'm using a 16mm lens, divide that into 500 gives me roughly 31 seconds. So if I go beyond 31 seconds with a 16mm lens, then I know that my stars will not be sharp, and I'll be capturing some movement and some trails, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But for just stars themselves, sharp stars, I know that that's my maximum, give or take. Again, if you're using a crop sensor, then don't forget to include that into the calculation. For example, on Canon crop sensors are 1.6, I think Nikon are 1.5, so just add that into your calculation as well. And that gives you the basic position on where to start on your shutter speed. So you can get very, very sharp, like this image of Durdle Door in Dorset in the UK, of the Milky Way. It's a designated dark sky area. But the Milky Way itself is very, very sharp, but obviously this has to be a composite because there wouldn't be sufficient light at 30 odd seconds or 25 seconds to light up the whole of the foreground. So that's unfortunately the nature of what we have to deal with. So the Milky Way is, well, the galactic core of the Milky Way that we're trying to photograph. It is quite difficult to see with the naked eye. I thought it would be a little bit easier to do so than actually is actually possible. But once there are plenty of apps to let you know where it's going to rise and fall. And for example, going back to this image, I wanted to position it around where the arch was of this the stone structure, the Durdle Door itself. So I waited until the right time and the right month and etc. for that to take place. So there are plenty of apps, as I say, to help you know where that is going to rise and fall and really help with your composition. As I say, Google can be your best friend. There's Google Earth and the maps and all that kind of thing, so you can really sort of see where you're going to be if you don't have the opportunity to go to that area in advance. You can certainly get an idea of what you're going to face when you get there. The Milky Way itself is going to change position throughout the year. In the Northern Hemisphere, March to October are the best months, so certainly it's a good time to get out and do it at the moment. It's important to find, as we had discussed earlier, you know, sort of limited light pollution, clear skies, and we want little to no moon, because if we have more than a quarter of a moon in the sky, it's just too distant and too far away, and it's going to wash out. That moonlight is so bright it will wash out all of the stars. So certainly you want to look for a new moon with clear skies, etc. So similarly, what we've just discussed above, use a wide aperture, use the 500 rule to determine your shutter speed based on your focal length, and a high ISO, as high as your camera can handle. Obviously, we want to be able to capture as much of information about the faint stars, so increasing the sensitivity of your ISO, but do obviously watch out, because ISO is one of the only element really of the exposure triangle of aperture and shutter speed that will degrade the quality of your images if you push it too far. So you want to sort of see what works best for your particular lens and camera combination. Moving on, so it's, as I say, it's a big trade-off. I've written about trackers. I wouldn't necessarily recommend anyone go out and buy a tracker at the moment. It's something that sort of tracks the movement of the stars and moves your camera. I would suggest image stacking is a good way to do it. So just take a number of images of the Milky Way back to back straight away, and then you can stack those on the top of each other in post-production, and that will really sort of help create much more information in your final image and a lot more detail. So that's a great way to sort of get around it and get much more detail in the Milky Way images. Just bear in mind there's a few bits, you know, the movement will be there'll be movement in between each image, so you just have to align those in post-production. And then moving on to star trails, which is definitely my favorite part of the photographing the night sky. This particular image is in the Florida Everglades, in the middle of nowhere. It ended up being the book cover, and just it was one of those adventure images for me. I drove into the middle of nowhere. You can see the light pollution of big cities in Miami in the distance, but it was an alligator-filled canal in the middle of the Everglades and a little sort of fishing shack in the distance, and just having parked in the middle of nowhere, it was a real sense of sort of, as I say, adventure, hoping that I wasn't going to meet an alligator face to face, even though you could hear them, not knowing what was around the corner. I'd read horror stories actually after the event of pythons going into cars, into the engine bays and things like that when they were parked up and coming out to surprise drivers later on. But everything just came together, and it was a result of planning and a bit of research and knowing what to do with the camera and which are, you know, the settings which I'm going to show you now. But it was just certainly an enjoyable image, and when you come back and see in post-production, it becomes ever so rewarding. So star trails capture the movement of the Earth as it rotates along its axis, as I've written here. Again, a lot of questions here about how do we do this? Do we use one long exposure or multiple exposures? And I have to say unequivocally, I think there are more reasons certainly to take lots of little photographs than one long one. I've written some here, but each time you take an image, you are risking the heat and noise coming off the camera, creating a lot of digital noise. Condensation will build up in cold night skies from the battery. So if you have one long photograph from a very long image, then you really are going to run the risk of a very noisy image. You're in the dark, your eyes will become accustomed to the dark, but before they do that, excuse me, sorry, you run the risk of tripping on the tripod or that sort of thing. So why risk an hour and a half for no real reason, really? I mean, the option to edit the individual layers, and we'll do that in a moment with the next image. You can take out light trails and things like that. So I'll show you, for example, this image here of the castle in the night sky. As I say, we're going to sort of deal with that in a moment, but you'll see from the original raw files that there were lots of aeroplanes flying over the night sky, and it's very nice to sort of have the option to take those out. So each individual layer enables you to do that. So that is certainly something to bear in mind. So the star trails themselves, the circular star trails, I should say, are all based around, just to move back, right in the center, the North Star. Obviously, in the southern hemisphere, it will be the southern star, but it's Polaris, the North Star in the northern hemisphere. And so, how do we find that? Is another popular question. The way to do that is to find Ursa Major or the Great Bear, or in North America it's called the Big Dipper, and there's the Little Bear as well. And literally, if you look at the right hand side, I would sort of see this as a big saucepan rather than a bear, but on the right hand side of the actual pan part, if you just use those two stars to guide you north straight off the top, you will eventually, the first brightest star that you meet will be the Polaris North Star. So that doesn't have to be in your image itself. So as we had just seen, oops, wrong way, excuse me. So this castle image, the North Star, you can see where the concentric circles of star trails are. It's just about out of frame, but you still would be able to position, know where the position was. But certainly in the images before that, or this example here, you can see where the North Star would be. And so that's the sort of a useful way to know how to find it in the night sky, because it's great to have all the apps and things like that, but sometimes just knowing roughly how to find quite a straightforward. The Great Bear is a very simple and very obvious constellation that you will see in the sky. This image here I've just put up just to sort of going back to talking about light pollution in the distance. We can see it's very difficult in the south of the UK to escape that. So there's always a town or sodium lamps or that will changing, but light pollution from big cities in the distance behind you. But also using a bright torch, you can see that in front of the windmill itself, I used a torch flashlight during these exposures to brighten up the foreground and really sort of help reveal a little bit more detail of the grass and the lighthouse itself. And that's another reason to use multiple exposures rather than one long exposure, because I wouldn't really be able to do that without running the risk on one single long exposure of an hour and a half without knowing what I was doing, potentially ruining the image. Here I can light up bits at a time and decide which bits I want to sort of use in the final image or not, whereas you'd just have no clue of what you were really doing if you were just taking one single image. And furthermore, it's very, very hard to determine how long on a single exposure for light trails you need, because obviously if you're going to say roughly you need to spend about an hour and a half at least at 30 seconds each, I think is a good sort of 90 minutes will give you a really nice star trails like this image here. But if you're taking a single image for for an hour and a half, you're going to let in a lot of light that may, depending on whether there's a bit of moonlight in the sky or ambient light, it will quite easily overexpose your foreground, and then you'll have a beautifully exposed stars, but quite a horrendously overexposed foreground. So really, there's no real reason, I think, to take a single exposure. There's plenty of free software, so you don't really need to buy Photoshop or pay for the subscription. You can just stack all your images very, very easily in post-production. So that's not really a reason there either. So where do we start with star trails if we are going to take individual images? Well, really, the suggested settings I would start with are a shutter speed of around 25 to 30 seconds. We want to blur the stars, so we're not going to use the 500 rule that we were just talking about for sharp stars, because that's just not relevant. this point. The aperture, again, it's a bit of a trade-off. Obviously, depth of field is an issue with using a very wide aperture. So shooting at f2.8, for example, lets in a lot of light, will help us capture a lot of star information from distant faint stars. But we also run the risk of, if we have a foreground interest like the windmill or the castle, shooting wide open, we're not necessarily going to end up with a sharp foreground by using a very wide aperture. So it's a bit of a trade-off. But I'd still recommend, depending on your subject matter and your composition, I think having an aperture of wide between 2.8 and f4. Again, ISO, we want to set the sensitivity. Obviously, it's a very common theme along in this presentation, is to make sure that we have sufficient ISO that's not too noisy, but enables us to capture very faint stars, because I do think that that's quite important. A very quick note, I know some questions have come in about intervalometers and remote releases. As I say, I use just a very simple cable release. I don't have to worry about batteries not working and that sort of thing. But if you're going to take images of beyond 30 seconds, most cameras require you to use bulb mode, which fortunately won't be possible without using a remote release. So an intervalometer can really help you set up to take multiple images at, say, 60 seconds each or something like that. Turn off noise, in-camera noise reduction, in-camera long exposure reduction, if you have those. I mentioned those earlier. We want smooth star trails, and so every time you take an image, you want to be taking another one as soon as possible, so that as the stars have moved, you don't have too many gaps between your images. If you waited for, say you were taking 60 seconds each image, if you were then applying in-camera noise reduction after each image, it would then take another image for 60 seconds, so you're wasting another minute. And if you're doing that every other minute, you're going to have quite a gappy star trail. So all of that sort of stuff I would turn off. Also, I think that they only work on JPEG files anyway, so if you're taking RAW, it's unnecessary to keep those on. And certainly our computers are far more powerful for noise reduction on basic software now, so I'd certainly process any of that, any noise reduction that you want to do on your desktop or laptop, rather than using your camera itself. Again, I've written here, fully charged batteries very quickly. Cold weather can deplete your batteries very quickly, as can long exposures. So fully charged batteries are a must. There's nothing worse than running out. Again, if you were taking one long image for an hour and a half for these star trails, you run the risk of that battery running out very quickly. A little tip is that if you keep batteries warm, they will sort of allow you to get some more energy from them. So if a battery does run out while you're in the field, put it in your pocket, keep it warm, and you'll find that if you put it back in the camera, you'll be able to use it for a little while longer as well. So that's always quite helpful if you think that you're stuck having run out of power. Obviously, it goes without saying, excuse me, that empty memory cards are a great place to start as well. If you're going to be taking hundreds of images, such as, for example, this image there's something about 350 single frames, so having a full memory card is important. I touched before on city limits, that being in the city, you can take star trail images in the city. I mean, if you can see stars on a clear night yourself out the window, then your camera will certainly be able to capture them, and as I've written here, likely much more. So that's always useful to know. Just bear in mind that you won't necessarily be using a 30-second exposure. Play with individual exposure times, take one frame, make sure that none of the foreground is too overexposed. You may well just have to result on a multitude of 2-second or 5-second exposures, but you certainly can do that and just combine all of those in post-production, and you'll be amazed at the results that you can achieve, really. So certainly you don't have to traipse into the middle of nowhere from the outset, try what you can see out of your window if at night, or if you have a garden, pop out there and see what, if in a clear sky, hopefully it will have some warm nights ahead and clear skies. So that's always a fun place to start. And again, how many images are too many for a star trail? It really depends, doesn't it? I think on personal taste, I've written here the Earth takes 24 hours, obviously, for one revolution. So do the maths, and it moves about 15 degrees an hour. The next image, as I'd say, there's some, nearly 400 images here. Is a very dense star trail compared to the next one, for example, where it works just as well in a different way, where it was absolutely freezing and I couldn't really stay that long to take that many images. So I think here I was, there must be about 100 or something like that, a bit less maybe. So it really sort of depends on personal taste and what you want to do. Bear in mind, as I've written here, the North Star in the middle, the movement of the stars closest to the North Star won't move as much as those further out, obviously. So you'll get a lot more light trail, star trail, excuse me, or the further out, the further away the stars are rotating around the North Star itself. As I say here, just a black and white image. Don't forget, sometimes that can look equally beautiful. Star trails are usually circular, based around the north or the south stars, main stars, pole stars. Here, for example, is what's called a well, it's clearly a non-circular star trail, but it's a photograph that's of the celestial equator, and that's basically where you point either due east or due west. In this case, this was in Montenegro, Sveti Stefan, a little beautiful island, and it was due west. So this is where the star trails themselves will look straight in the middle and then towards the two poles on either side. So you can actually get quite a beautiful effect there in this image here, in sort of the sort of 11 o'clock position, or if you saw it as a clock phase. There's two comets that was lovely to sort of capture, shooting stars as well, are quite often quartz, and in the foreground there's some light trails of boats that were moving around on in that scene. So because it's a long exposure, it captures that movement too. One quick thing to bear in mind here was this a church in Kent. It was sort of quite difficult to control the exposure because it was floodlit. Beautiful church, but very difficult to capture that without too much overexposure and getting sufficient light in the sky. But also, really, what I wanted to emphasize here was straightening your buildings, that sort of thing. It will warp the how circular the star trails are. So in post-production, you can see in the bottom image where I straightened to deal with the lens corrections. It ended up warping the star trails themselves quite a lot. And then finally, you could play around with sort of vortexes and things like that. Obviously not natural, they're all done in post-production just for a bit of fun. I won't really sort of delve into the useful apps and websites. Again, you'll be able to access these if you watch back or on this video in due course once you receive the video of this webinar. And I just wanted to very quickly touch on BenQ monitors. I am proud to be a BenQ expert. I use 2 BenQ monitors for all of my work, and astrophotography is very light sensitive, and color rendition is very, very important. That's something that you get very well with the BenQ monitors. They're calibrated out of the box from the factory, which is pretty much spot on, but I just wanted to show a picture of a screen calibrator, the X-Rite i1 Display Pro, which is another fab piece of kit, which I use regularly to make sure that all of my monitors and my laptop all show the same image quality in color rendition and that sort of thing. So that's very important and something that you should really sort of bear in mind. I think the excuse me, I can't even say it, how fragile the light is in capturing the star trails. This color rendition is very, very important. And the kind folks at Color Confidence and BenQ are offering 5% off all of the SW range of monitors for you guys as a thank you for attending this webinar. So please do just use the code BenQ5 at colorconfidence.com to take advantage of that. Right, I'm going to sort of bounce very quickly now. I am conscious of time, so I'm just going to pop out of this and literally bring up my Lightroom to show you this image from the this is the just basic raw file from my part of one of the sequence of star trails that I took for this castle image. I was going to show you the before. I guess I can show you the before and after. Yeah, sorry, bear with me. And oh, let's just go straight into it. Actually, it's just easier to do it this way. You can see here where I've highlighted, if I just scroll through, hopefully you can see some of the movement on the water and the lights and the reflections, the trees moving. This is a very small, I've just selected 56 odd photos here from a sequence of a good 250, 300. But I just wanted to show some very, very basic edits because, for example, if I deselect, this is straight out of a raw file, as I say, CR2 for it's a Canon raw file, no edits here at all, and this is what I see out of camera. And we're going to combine those in post-production to create the final image. And to do so, what I was going to do was just show you very quickly some of the edits that I would make on the panel here below. So usually just starting at the white balance, just ever so slightly, just I would want to sort of reduce the Kelvin and just reduce the temperature and make the sky a little bit more blue. Exposure here I think is just a touch under, so I was going to move that up just a little bit. You can see how quickly it's washing out the sky, so I wouldn't want to go as far as 55, 40, that's a half a stop of light, so maybe just a quarter stop of light. A very important thing I think here for Lightroom sliders and edits, it's very easy to over accentuate, and just go slide and think, oh, well, that's fabulous. Now I can see all the foreground, etc. But I think if you just do things very subtly, very gently, and use the backspace key on your keyboard, and you can see the before and the after, and you can see in the right-hand corner, it shows you before because I'm holding down the backspace key, and let go and after, and I can see the edits. I can see what they are actually doing to as I make these changes to my image. So here, what I would do is literally just open up the shadows slightly to reveal a little bit more of the foreground. So probably not quite so much, maybe a sort of a 50. So again, just before it's very, very dark, and now we've let in a little bit more light into the foreground of the trees and that sort of thing. Contrast is always good to boost this, so a little bit more, again, not going too high, so 33, something like that. And we can see that it's really sort of starting to take a little bit more shape here. And then I think on the highlights, I just increases a touch. Obviously, you don't want to go too far, so say something like 16. Obviously, this area here where I'm moving the mouth on the left-hand side is easily going to get overexposed, and there's a light tint from the light pollution in the distance. But again, just before and after, you can sort of see now the sky's got a lot more detail, and the foreground's got a lot more detail, the castle itself. Whites and blacks, I think I just opened up the blacks a little bit, yeah, just to sort of, again, just subtly. And the whites I didn't change in this particular image, but quite often that can be something that can really sort of help move the camera around, the white point around. I always check for pretty much every image, remove chromatic aberrations. So that will reveal any of the sort of, defects, the digital defects that happen between the edges, along the edges of where you have bright and dark contrast. So it's a good tip to always tick that box anyway. Sometimes, in this example, I'm not going to use my lens corrections. I usually do, but not always. You'll find that here, so without with, it's making it a bit too green along the top right hand, the right hand side here and opening up too much of that foreground information, and I want that to remain in a bit more of a silhouette. So I've left that. And then just scrolling down ever so slightly into the shadows. Again, I think just opening up the shadows a touch just to reveal a little bit more light onto the castle itself is definitely the place to go. And then once we're happy, I think I'm quite happy. So this was the before and after. So that's the starting point for one of the images for the image trails. And all you have to do here is where we've got a little selection is this image down on the bottom left, the third one over is the one that I've just edited. If you choose, I'll just, for example, say, just literally highlight. So I'm holding the shift key and click at the end of the sequence. Say this was, you could do this for all 300 or 200 or however many images that you've taken. And then you just click the sync mode button here on the right hand side, click sync, make sure everything is selected. There's a check all or check none if not. Not that we've used spot removal, and then just click synchronize, and the computer is now put all of the same and all of those edits into the same into these successive files. So now if we click onto the next one, we'll see that our edits are here on the right hand side, and the next one, and everything is identical now, and they'll be ready to import into Photoshop. And I'll just do that. I'm not going to directly do it because I've sort of pre-done it, but what you would do here is you just select your images, hold down your control key, and it says here edit as layers in Photoshop. It's grayed out because for some reason Lightroom can't find the folder with the I've moved the folder on from my desktop. So but normally this would be highlighted, and you just click through that and it would open automatically. Lightroom and Photoshop communicate between one another very, very well, and ultimately your image will open up just like this. And here this is I've sort of, because of time constraints, got everything ready in advance, but this is the same same file that we've just edited ourselves. Using the layers, I've been able to pick out one or two more layers. So here, if I click on light reflection 2, you can see down here, it's just adding in a little bit more of a nice little light reflection from the castle that was before. That's adding just that layer in itself. And if I want to bolster another one, I can again just add that in. But we can see here, it's actually taking out some of the detail here that I preferred the reflection without that one. It's much darker and a nicer sort of balance there. So maybe we'll leave that one out. So once you've got all your images and they open up, when you've opened up your export from Lightroom, you'll see that you'll have a long list here. They won't have any colors. That's just, I'll explain that in a moment, but you'll just have all of your files here in one long list. I've just grouped them together into a folder for convenience here, just for this demonstration, but it just makes it a little bit more manageable to turn them on and off in one go. But literally all we have to do is highlight them all. So again, in a similar process, you highlight the top one, you scroll down to the bottom one, all the way down, and holding the shift key, you'll find that they're all highlighted. And this blend mode here, all we have to do, where it was on normal, is move it down to lighten. And all that will do is anything that's lighter in any of the successive files the image files will become visible. So literally, if we turn this group on, you'll see that nothing much changes except, hopefully, he says, in anticipation with Photoshop that's struggling. Of course, the spinning wheel. Here we go. So now we have the light trails from that sequence of images that we've from within this folder. Why don't I, sorry, bear with me, I'll just close Lightroom just to give me a little bit more option to, this file itself is about 8 gigabytes, so that's why my old computer is struggling a little bit. But here you'll find that all of them combined now are in one place and giving us the light trails themselves. I'm moving a little bit too fast for my computer, so apologies. Okay, so what I want to say very quickly, the benefits here of having all your images in one folder. I just moved that, close that folder for the time being. Where we've imported the individual files that you can see here now, if I zoom in, we've got aeroplanes in the sky here, leaving light trails across here, down here. Move. Got to love technology with when you're doing a live demonstration. So apologies, and also the light here down on the right hand side, it's brought in all as the lights were flickering, as the water was moving away around. We were getting quite a lot of movement in this light itself. There are actually some ducks that were on the water. If I move down, hopefully, if the computer behaves, here we go. You can see they were captured here. This is just ducks floating around on the surface in the dark, and we've got some dead pixels here and here. So we would want to get rid of those. To deal with the ducks and the lights, I picked out the lights that I liked. So I like the lights just to look like that, and turning off that group. Quite simply, all we have to do is use a layer mask. So to do so, just pop this on. There is an icon just down here. This one, it's a white square with a black circle. And when you click that on, I've done it here already, but you get a little white square, and white will show everything below it, and black will hide elements from view. So if I just I don't really want to, I won't delete this layer mask, but what at the moment, what it's doing is revealing the lights in the sky, the circular light trails from the stars, but this black area here is masked out this area here. So if I click on Shift, you can see where I've masked out the top left, there was a bit of movement in the tree up here, and I've masked out this area here. So none of this is visible from those original layers at the bottom of the stack that I have here. So all the information that's in the bottom left corner and the top left corner are coming from these two original files. Apologies if that sounds probably more technical than it needs to do, but it's really just to remove this area here from view. And so what I could do now is use each individual. I'll show you how a layer mask works now, for example. So I know I've marked out in advance these orange files here. If I zoom into this aeroplane trail here that is flying down in through the image, if I remove these four orange, it's disappeared. So if we go back and click them back, you can see that it's reappeared. And so what you want to do, oops, excuse me, I moved too fast, is if we create a layer mask here very quickly, we just push this button down here, the white square, and it's created a white layer mask, which has done nothing to the image at the moment, because you imagine it's like a stencil and you can see through this white box. But if we get a brush using the B key, and down here we just select black, and all we have to do is draw over this section. You can see that in front of you, hopefully it's disappearing. Zoom in a bit more. So as you draw over, that light trail's gone. And then you would just move down to the next one, add in a layer mask, and do the same thing. And you can literally just draw through and remove nothing else except these, or there's a tiny bit there. If you want to go back, you just paint with white, and it replaces that little bit of star trail. Make the brush smaller, back to black, and then we just mask that little bit out. And again, we just draw out and it disappears. And I'm not going to do that now because it's quite a laborious process for this demonstration, but hopefully you get the idea. I've marked out the yellow, so this was the other the other aeroplane trail that was over here. And again, I would then do some edits in Photoshop, such as, which I've done here, just to straighten the side of the buildings a little bit more, makes it a little bit more of a balanced image. So zoom out, and you can see. So that was the sort of before and after. Adding some curves. So curves are quite useful. I've just added a little bit of brightness here. So this was before, much darker, but letting a lot more light. And again, another curves just to brighten up the sky a little bit more. And all of a sudden, we've gone from the original raw file, if I turn everything off, from that ultimately to that, in quite an easy way. I mean, literally, I know I'm rushing through it in a few minutes on this demonstration, but it's a very, very quick, fast, easy way to edit things out. I know the light trail is still visible because I haven't masked that particular one out, because we didn't really draw, we only removed part of it. But that's literally all you have to do here. We could mask out the ducks moving in the same way. If we scroll down, we can see that they're still here, but it's a quite easy way to mask those out. And one last very quick tip I'm going to give before I just answer a few questions that have come through is a very easy, quick, fast way in Photoshop to remove the dead pixels that we can see here. For example, this green, and down here is to use dust and speckles. So this filter here, hopefully I can find it, is noise. If you use, sorry, not speckles, dust and scratches, and if we use that, it's probably not going, yeah, and then just on 1%, 1 pixel, it's probably not going to do it because I'm on the wrong image. So if I do it on this one, let's try that again, just very quickly. It's a very fast way to get rid of it, and just go down to noise, dust and scratches, and you'll find that 1%, it does a pretty good job once we click OK. One pixel radius. Okay, computer's just struggling to do this. And while it does that, I'm just going to answer a couple of questions that have come in. I know that, sorry, I'm just looking over. Martin, oh, here we go. So that's removed some, not as many as I had hoped. So what we could do is go back in and dust and scratches. And we just increase this radius slightly until we see that they should move. So if we make it 4%, you can see that they've disappeared from the screen. If I move it back to 1, you'll see that it reappears again. Here's the green one, and there's the blue one up there. So if we literally just go back to, I'm just going to go a bit extreme, maybe not 4, but to 5 or 6, and just let that process. And just to answer Martin's question very quickly, I don't have presets really in Lightroom, Photoshop. I find that I mean, it's a way of speeding up the process, but I find that each individual image is a little bit too unique to just sort of apply a one-size-fits-all solution. So actually, I find that it's better to deal with one, and then you're copying and pasting it. Yeah, sure, you can create your own Lightroom preset to apply on other images, but quite often you'll find that one size won't fit all. What works for one photographer and their images won't necessarily work for another. And also, I've got a question here from Dave. The exposure time for the radio telescopes, that was 30 seconds for each individual image that was stacked up. So hopefully, I just, as I say, don't use an intervalometer personally, and I normally take most of my images at 30 seconds and just lock the shutter to completely sort of, as soon as it's finished taking one image, start taking the next one. So I usually, for my star trails, choose between 25 and 30 seconds, depending on the ambient light and that sort of thing. So hopefully that gives you a bit more of an insight. I know there's a lot of information here to take in. I'm conscious of time and not taking up too much more of your time, but hopefully there's information there that you'll all find useful. Just to pop back on to minimize that and show you back on just the keynote. One last quick reminder, just to sort of say that obviously please do check out Color Confidence and BenQ. lovely folks who are hosting today's presentation. And yeah, really, it's been my pleasure to hopefully educate you, give you some inspiration, and you know, some techniques and tips and tricks that you can all go out and take some style photos. Please do feel free to check out my website, and I post a lot of free tutorials, written tutorials, that sort of thing, and you can get in contact with me there or Instagram at Antony Z Photo. I'd be delighted to answer any questions or and see what images you guys come up with. So fantastic. Hopefully you are all feeling a little bit more inspired, and that's the main thing. Fabulous. Okay, well, at that point, I will say goodbye and wish you a wonderful week ahead. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll say goodbye. Bye-bye.